Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome for the Frivolous Formed Club, or the Serious Formed Club. Joseph Pearce, Vivian Dudro, Father Fessio. We're going to start on a new book this time, American Pilgrimage by Christopher Shannon. Subtitle, A Historical Journey Through Catholic Life in a New World. New World being North and South America, but especially North America. And I want to make a proposal which is subject to any amount of revision or correction or objection. Since this is a historic book, a book of history, and history is made up of all kinds of details, we can't cover all the details. But some details strike one person or another as more interesting, more significant, or more humorous, whatever. So I'm going to propose that we kind of give an overview of the part we're going to cover, and then enter in any details people want to bring up. Is that okay, or do you have another way we should do this?
That sounds like a good modus operandi to me.
Yep.
All right. Well, it starts with an introduction. That's a great way to start, I think. I'll commend the book for that. First sentence of the first page of the book. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. America discovered Christ in 1531. Those are pretty bald statements, but he qualifies them afterwards, because obviously he didn't discover it. It was already here, and people knew it was here, that living here. And, it wasn't 1531 they discovered Christ, because there were missionaries there before. But in a generic overview sense, I think it's a reasonable first approximation.
Can I say something there? Still sticking to the overview, but I'm the one who's most ignorant of all of this, North American history, and I thought that first of all that's a very good, eye-catching, gripping way of starting a book, and also actually when he then the rest of it, the introduction and the whole section on Spain, I think reinforces that statement because. That the Christopher Columbus discovering America in 1492 was clearly largely a city of man, secular endeavor, and clearly they were not receiving much success in converting the natives to the faith, largely because of the hideous behavior of many of the Spanish secular people, and it took, quite frankly, a divine intervention miracle to bring about the conversion that human action was not bringing about because of human greed. So I think that, although you're completely correct, and he does state immediately afterwards how this is an oversimplification and a generalization, I think it's very largely true that basically it was a direct divine intervention by the Mother of God that actually brought about the evangelization of North America.
Well, part one is called Seas, and chapter one is Spain. Chapter 2 will talk about France. So let's talk about the overview of Spain. As you know, October 12th was normally Christopher Columbus Day. In many places now Indigenous Peoples Day. Why? Because there is a description of the history of the coming into the Americas of the European explorers of what we call it. Destruction and oppression and harm and so on. And certainly this chapter does not try and obfuscate that or to downplay that. On the other hand, we look at what was brought by the conquistadores, whether it was kind of indirect or not. A language, a form of order, a culture, and so on, and Christianity as well, obviously. So it's obviously an event with mixed consequences, So how do we look at this entrance of Spain into this new world? Is it the great golden age that we are creating because of bringing Christian civilization? Or is it the destruction of native cultures and the oppression and putting to death, mainly through disease, of the inhabitants?
Does it have to be so binary?
Well, yeah. These days, people are against binary things, so I suppose in this area we can allow for sfumature. It would say in Italian, little, different shades on the screen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because as Joseph pointed out, and the author himself did in his introduction, quoting from St. Augustine's City of God, which we read together on this program, there is this constant conflict between the city of man and the city of God, between sin and conversion from sin. And this struggle is going to go on to the end of time. And so why not just look at it honestly and praise where things are praiseworthy and criticize when things are not? I mean, why can't we do both of those things? I think that would be healthy even on the level of national discourse if we could do both of those things.
Yeah, we have to agree, of course, upon what is good and what is evil, and that's the first problem in a relativistic culture. But I do think that his approach is spot on. He differentiates and distinguishes between Augustine's City of God and Augustine's City of Man, and that's the conflict. And the Spanish Conquistadors are certainly much more concerned with self-empowerment and with gaining riches in the belief, largely incorrect, of limitless gold. So the irony is, of course, that it is about self-empowerment, which is, the whole Nietzschean modernity and post-modernity is about self-empowerment. You get a race of people coming over that have all technological advances over other people so they can do what they like. If you have no Christian virtue, they're going to do what they like. And ironically, that the morality we're talking about is the same sort of do your own thing, irrespective of any objective moral criteria that we see at play amongst the woke. So there is actually an irony here. This is sort of the Nietzschean doing what he likes because he can, right? Empowerment.
Well, Vivian and I grew up in a society where, at least conceptually, there was a distinction between church and state and a division of roles and in society. You grew up, Joseph, in a place where there's a state religion, although there's still kind of a separation of church and state, even in England, I think practically. But I wonder to what extent, in this discovery and conquest, that non-separation church and state was the root of a lot of these problems, because, you didn't have just the Spanish coming in and wanting to find gold, and the missionaries just coming in and wanting to evangelize. You had, Hernan Cortez, who went to mass every day, and prayed the office. And you've got this Archbishop of Burgos, I think it was, who was an encomendiero who owned all these slaves. So there was a real blurring, it seems to me, of the distinction between church and state that was part of the root of this problem, seems to me, of what took place.
Yeah, it's the perennial problem. If the church is in bed with the world in whatever constitutional context, it becomes corrupt. But if the church isn't in bed with the world, it becomes persecuted. So, there's this oscillation between the two that really characterize history.
Well, another irony is that you see the conflict almost more keenly in the sovereigns who are actually trying to bring about the evangelization of their subjects. So in Ferdinand and Isabella, you have for example, on page 17 in the middle, Isabella saw the salvation of her subjects as part of her responsibility as a Catholic queen. And I think the historical record bears that out, that she took that responsibility really seriously. But at the same time, she herself is conflicted, because when the profits are not rolling in the way they should, she herself is exercising pressure. And so it's funny that you see the conflict more keenly when someone's actually trying. When you have sovereigns who really don't care, I think there's a tragedy to a queen like Isabella who's actually trying, and yet she wants wealth and power for Spain too. That is also her duty as being the sovereign of Spain.
And there was talk. Sorry, Father.
And so it's a conflict. It's an inner conflict in herself.
Yeah. Someone once said you can't serve two masters.
Right.
Yeah, I do think early on he said, again, obviously it's blurred with these, exactly as Vivian's just said, but that one of the reasons she wanted the gold and to get this western route to the Indies with Columbus was in order to have enough funds to fund a new crusade to liberate Jerusalem from the infidel. So that even then, the quest for gold in the service of, should we say, Christian militarism, whatever we might think of that, it was part of the motive. In other words, she would probably have thought that it wasn't just a question of getting gold for its own sake, but that we needed this gold for the good of Christendom.
Well, and the initial goal was not to get gold. I mean, I'm taking Christopher Shannon as giving me facts which I otherwise wouldn't have access to, and I don't have any aliunde, other great sources on this. But when you look at if we contextualize this in two ways. One, even Christian culture was more barbarous. I mean, they as far as punishment, cutting off someone's leg, that was considered
splitting a nose.
Yeah, that sort of stuff. But on the other, you think Spain had gone through 800 years of domination by Islam, and they gradually, worked their way back, and finally in 1492 at Granada, they took back their country, so to speak. So you've got a long, century-long history of opposition, hostility to Muslims, right? And so now Columbus says, we can go back and take back Jerusalem too, but we need more Catholics. We need more people to help us. Let's go convert these people in Asia. That's what he wanted to do, I think, right? I mean, and it was only when they got there and thought they were in Asia, but they weren't. And then he found out, well, these, we can't really convert these people easily. And there's a lot of gold here. The whole thing transformed into let's take over and let's get the gold.
And the irony, of course, is that Christopher Columbus's mission was necessary because of another major Catholic nation, Portugal, basically controlling the trade routes around the Horn of Africa, basically not allowing the Spanish access to the Indies. So you have this, this tension between Catholic nations that leading to this alternative way of trying to get to Asia. So, yeah.
Right, but even Columbus was a man of mixed. He also wanted to be, commander of all the oceans of the world and all this. Right. It isn't like, he just wanted to do this to, free the Holy Land. But what I was trying to say about Isabella herself being conflicted on page 27, where he's describing the encomienda system, which the crown set up thinking it was going to allow for less exploitation of the natives, right? Somehow. But sadly, the colonists charged with implementing this royal system had little concern for the stated ideals of justice and evangelization designed to protect natives from exploitation by colonists encomienda served merely to facilitate the development of a de facto slave labor system. The colonists could reasonably argue that Ferdinand and Isabella's own high expectations of profit did not allow them the luxury of such noble ideals. And by the way, when they got the crew for these ships, these Spanish ships, where did they recruit the people to crew these ships? Because often the majority of the men on these ships and these voyages died of scurvy. Never mind all the other problems that you would encounter, like storms and shipwrecks and everything else. It was risky business going on a boat and going across an ocean. And the way they would fill the crews often would be to go to the prisons and say to these guys, oh, you're rotting in here. How would you like your freedom? But that means you've got a crew on my boat. So when they did make landfall, the men on these ships, maybe the officer class were praying their offices or whatever, but the crew could be made up of the most, really, down at the bottom of the barrel people, because those were the people who were willing to take that job to get out of jail free card, So that's something to keep in mind, because we keep hearing over and over and over again about the pillaging, the raping, even the raping of children, that the Padres and the Franciscan mission system had to lock up the women and children at night to keep them from being raped by the soldiers in the Presidio or these weren't, the pillars of society who were getting on board these ships.
Well, and then, a sidebar to that on page 36, where it talks about, in the middle of the page, Isabella's abhorrence of native slavery was in part a function of her sense of her responsibilities as a Christian sovereign. Africa was beyond Castilian sovereignty, so African slavery was allowed as a private transaction among merchant traders. So she tried to mitigate or mitigate the idea of abusing natives because it was her territory. But then her idea of doing that ended up making a slave labor situation, a feudal situation.
And right after that, Father, where it says, some 20 years later, Las Casas, meaning Bartolome de las Casas, could suggest African slavery as a solution to the labor shortage in the islands. Well, it wasn't only the labor shortage, by the way, brought on by the decimation of Western diseases that these people had no immunity to.
Right.
But also when Las Casas was converted and now became an advocate for the dignity of the natives and tried to free them from exploitation and slavery, he was willing to substitute Black slaves for them initially. Yeah. Because a lot of the Europeans, they weren't sure when they encountered these other peoples whether or not they were fully human.
That's right.
And then when they realized, oh my goodness, these are fully human beings, just like you and me. Then Las Casas had a change of heart, but by then it was a little late. He had already facilitated the importation of Black slaves to free the natives from slavery because he'd become an advocate for the natives.
I mean, obviously he's compromised there, but if I may play, rather than devil's advocate, divine advocate here, there's a couple of good quotes, and let's begin with his. The one on page 37, where he repents of actually making that suggestion.
Yes, he does.
He's writing about himself here, so he doesn't mention, he mentions his own name. He's writing, well, I'll read it. The cleric La Casas, here he writes himself in the third person, first gave this opinion that license should be granted to bring Negro slaves to these countries, the Indies, without realizing with what injustice the Portuguese captured and enslaved them, and afterward, not for everything in the world would he have offered it, for he had always held that they were made slaves by injustice and tyranny, the same reasoning applying to them as to the Indians. So yes, of course he's compromised by acceding to that or even suggesting it, but we should always, I think, be charitable to a repentant soul, and he's certainly a penitent spirit there. And if I can just look at page 32, the Dominican, this is the beginning of Advent, 1511, the Dominican Antonio de Montesinos, I'm sorry, my Spanish is awful, preached 2 dramatic sermons in Santo Domingo condemning, in the strongest possible terms, the Spanish treatment of the Indians. And this is his quote: "Tell me, by what right or justice do you keep these Indians in such cruel and horrible servitude? Why do you keep them so oppressed and weary, not giving them enough to eat, nor taking care of them in their illnesses? For the excessive work you demand of them, they fall ill and die, or rather you kill them with your desire to extract and acquire gold every day. Are these not men? Have they not rational souls? Are you not bound to love them as you love yourselves? Be certain that in such a state as this, you can no more be saved than the Moors or Turks." I mean, that's very forthright. And I think it does encapsulate, albeit a minority and largely powerless view, the view of the city of God, which authentic Christendom brought to
Right,
the New
but even he is still imprisoned in a sense in his own worldview, because he's not saying liberate them. He's saying, okay, slaves, he's assuming slaves are all right, but he's saying, but don't treat them so badly, instruct them and so on. So
these Dominican, oh, sorry, Father.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's not calling for the emancipation of the slaves.
But the Dominican friars do eventually do just that.
Yeah,
and in fact, that is what brings about Bartolome de las Casas's conversion when he's going to confession. He's a secular cleric at this point, has a hacienda in Cuba, one of the most wealthy men in the Indies. And he goes to confession to one of these Dominican friars who came to the Indies, and the man refuses to absolve him unless he frees his slaves. Not just treat them better, free them. And this is what brings about Las Casas's deeper conversion. He frees his slaves, gets rid of his hacienda, joins the Dominican friars, and then ends up becoming an advocate for the natives. So there were actually people calling for the emancipation of slaves even back then in the mid 1500s, and Las Casas joined that team.
Right, but I don't think much.
It might not have been this particular Dominican,
right,
but
right.
And then eventually both the crown and the Pope also condemned slavery in the New World. And this predates our own emancipation of slaves, by 300 years.
Yeah, and again, I think if we the 2 things I'd like to say, as we're looking at an overview here, obviously the saints are a small and relatively powerless minority in terms of political power. The city of man is always triumphant in a worldly sense within the confines of time. That's the way it works. The city of God is something which is fought out, if you like, here, but is the victories won in eternity, in the heavenly Jerusalem. So we see the saints here as being conflicted, but as a small but I would say noble minority. And I think the key thing is that within this context, I'm English, right, and I'm European, and I never knew anything much about Our Lady of Guadalupe. Our Lady of Walsingham, yes, Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Fatima, but not so much about Our Lady of Guadalupe. And I must admit, reading this has really opened my eyes and heart to the real magnificence and magnificat of her appearing, that apparition, with the preferential option for the poor in the midst of this city of man mess, right? The city of God intervenes with the Blessed Virgin appearing to a poor Native American, one of the very few Native American converts. And it's through that we have this miraculous grace of mass conversion, not because of any worldly designs by Isabella and Ferdinand, however noble or otherwise they might be. And for me, if you see it in that context, we have a miraculous intervention here, which we should all be celebrating.
Well, now you know why the official corporate name of Ignatius Press is Guadalupe Associates, Inc.
Yes, and I must confess, Father, when you first published me 25 years ago, I had no idea. Guadalupe was somewhere in Mexico. That's about all I knew.
But you made Vivian, I'm sure you do have knowledge beyond the book here, but on page 31 at the top, he talks about the turning point in Las Casas' relation with the natives came when a priest denied him absolution on the grounds that his pursuit of riches was causing him to neglect his duty to instruct natives in the faith. I mean, this doesn't say he was told to free him.
Well, the book that we published about Las Casas by Olazzola, the Spanish historical novelist.
Okay.
In that book, Las Casas was challenged to free his slaves. He was a priest, and this man,
right? I know that.
So this man was saying, "You're a priest," and on top of it, so that's how it came across in that book.
Okay.
By the way, speaking of other books published by Ignatius, I just want to give a shout out to Kevin Starr's Continental Ambitions, which is quoted over and over and over again in this book. If you notice, a good deal of the footnotes are Continental Ambitions by Kevin Starr, who went to a lot of the original sources.
Yes.
But in any case, Las Casas did free his slaves, did get rid of his hacienda, became a poor Dominican friar as a result of this conversion experience. And another thing to realize too, I mean, Christians, because of the way our faith is, we do have this capacity for self-criticism and repentance, which is part of our faith. And when you look at what the Aztec religion was like and the Aztec empire that Cortez brought down, with this thousands of human sacrifices, tearing out living hearts, the Aztecs controlled this huge empire, and all these towns had to give tributes every year of their young men and women to be offered in sacrifice. And so it's pointed out here that when Cortez brought the empire down, he had plenty of help from the others who were oppressed by the Aztecs, right?
That's right.
So what was brought down? Well, I think I'm glad it was brought down. Unfortunately, then, when Spain built its own empire on top of this one, maybe they weren't ripping out living hearts, but they crushed a lot of lives, And so, but is that what we're doing now? I mean, there's this constant call for renewal, and that's a good thing, isn't it?
Well, I once years ago did the calculation, because I like numbers and things, of the number of human sacrifices in Mexico City as a proportion of the population of the surrounding area. I forget the exact numbers, but it was a smaller percentage than the proportion of abortions in America to our population. So yes, we criticize them for that, rightly so, while we do something which is not as visible. We don't go up to a big high ziggurat type deal and tear out their hearts and hold them up their beating, but we destroy them in the womb.
Right.
It's the same thing. It's a little more antiseptic.
Yeah, right, and we have a leaven in this society who resist that and fight against it and pray against it, and so that capacity for renewal is there.
Amen.
We have to keep praying for it.
My objection is that the fact, Father, you use the phrase Freudian slip, or perhaps or whatever, that we, right, and I, if we're going to keep referencing the city of God and the city of man. Right, that the people who support infanticide, the killing of babies in the United States, are on the same side as the Aztecs. It's not we and them as regards, we as Americans and them as the Aztecs. It's them as the Aztecs and the abortionists together against those who think the infanticide is an abomination.
I agree. I want to give a shout out to this very pastoral, compassionate confessor here. I mean, that's what could happen when a priest who hears confessions is willing to speak the truth to those who come. And of course, if someone's come into confession, that's already a step towards willingness to repent. But let's not have any more therapy in the confessional. Let's have pastoral truth. I want to bring this up. I'm pretty sure that the people coming from Europe to the Americas do not intend to bring diseases. They weren't. It wasn't like biological warfare, which we sometimes engage in now. But it does seem like a horrible unforeseen consequence of them coming here, and what would have happened if they hadn't had that, situation where the natives were not resistant to these diseases. But I mean, the greatest devastation, I think, was disease, right?
Yes, and this author points that out. It did become biological warfare, however, when some military operations, the leaders had figured this out, and they actually contaminated things with smallpox and sent them as gifts and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, it's a terrible thing to have to admit, but it did happen.
As a general principle, this was an accidental consequence.
Yes, in general, it was accidental, and for people to refer to it as a genocide, as if it were deliberate, is certainly an injustice.
Absolutely. Well, are we ready to conclude this?
Well, let's quickly go through and see if there's any other particular details that, I thought was interesting that Columbus was a third order Franciscan and wore Franciscan robes, as an adult. Let's see here.
Well, I like towards the end, if we are talking about this, I'm obviously very into cultural apologetics. On the pages 72 and 73, we see how, I think it's the Franciscans, music, most especially singing, was also a central part of the Franciscan evangelization effort. And then further down, page 72, as in medieval Europe, the friars also used liturgical drama to instruct the faithful, and particularly nativity plays. So again, how do you convert people? Obviously through charity, through examples of love, but also through this cultural apologetics, right? Through the beauty of music, the beauty of drama. And that's another way of bringing people to Christ.
On page 33, this is a cautionary tale. Bottom of the page, about 8 lines up. Las Casas met with strong opposition from the president of the council, Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca, Archbishop Burgos. He was a wealthy encomendero. So, again, the danger of wealth, especially in religious. On page 34, new paragraph, calls for reform would find a more sympathetic ear in Francisco Carlos Jimenez de Cisneros, Archbishop of Toledo. Now, this is happening in the early 1800s, before the Protestant Reformation or Revolution. And I know Cisneros, there are several ecclesiastics with that name, but I think this is the Cisneros who actually began a reform movement in Spain prior to the Protestant Revolution, and which is one reason why the Protestant, influence did not get to Spain that much, because it already had a reform movement. That Cisneros recognized the problems that Luther and others recognized, but he had already initiated within the church a plan to restore, the purity of the church. So that was a good thing, it seems to me.
And then there was Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, right?
Yeah,
right.
but they
were after, though.
They're post Luther, however.
Yeah. So, Father, just above what you just put on page 33, I highlighted the fact that Las Casas, and we've talked about how the fact, he's good, a noble, compromised, and repentant. But here, this is courage. Reminds me of St. Thomas More, having courage to stand up against Henry VIII, who was a tyrant. Now, Ferdinand's not a tyrant, but Las Casas pulled no punches, just above where you just quoted from. Addressing an aged king who would be dead within a month, he charged that the treatment of the natives under his rule placed the salvation of his soul at stake. Again, that takes courage, right, to address the king in that way.
Absolutely. Also, I was interested in, on page 42, just the fact that the city of Tenochtitlan, which I think became Mexico City, had a population of roughly 200,000, when the Spain's largest city had only 70,000. So that was
3 times the size. That raised my eyebrows too, I must admit.
Yeah,
and that's the page which itemizes the human sacrifice.
We have a now controversial title of a book about Isaac Jones, I think, called Saint Among Savages. And you might, to some extent, when you look what the Hirogoy did, Mohawks and so on, you could call them savages. I think that's legitimate, but not the Aztecs. I mean, at least in their civilization,
Yes.
they had, it was, yeah. Let's see.
Well, Carthage was civilized, right? I mean, but civilization in that sense of the word does not mean you're not absolutely barbaric in other senses.
It means you got cities, yeah. You got chivas.
Yeah.
I like the fact that we find out that the Mississippi River's first name was Rio Espiritu Santo, Holy Spirit River.
Yeah,
Just like San Francisco Bay was initially called La Bahia de Santa Maria de Guadalupe Marinera, the Bay of Our Lady of Guadalupe Mariner. By the way, that's how Marin County gets its name. It's actually a title of Mary.
Interesting.
And then on 69, the barbarity of the, Spaniards, the Acoma men responded by attacking and killing 13 Spaniards. So what did the Spaniards do? They assaulted the city of Pueblo, Sky City, killing 800 natives, and then all men of over 25 had a foot amputated. I mean,
and the 13 Spanish were killed, if I remember correctly, because of the fact they'd been raping the Native American women.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was actually, I'm not saying it's a bona fide eye for an eye, but you can understand the initial anger, and then the response to this, understandable outrage is something much more outrageous, right?
That's right. Often these native raids on the Spanish, even on the Spanish missions, were precipitated by the Spaniards mistreating their women or whatever, and then the reprisal would be just so brutal and beyond any proportion. So
and that's why Jesus and Christianity will have overcome the Old Testament idea of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That Old Testament idea was not so bad, because what happens here is you take my eye, I'll take all 6 of your children's eyes out. You take my tooth out, I'm going to take break the jaws of everybody in your village. So, even in the Old Testament, there was the reprisal should be equal to the offense, not a escalation.
And carried out against the offender, not against the innocent.
Exactly.
Right. And of course, the other aim here, when you come to conquering people, conquering others, the other aim is, it's not just meting out justice, it's also a reign of terror. You're going way beyond what justice would demand in order to terrorize the rest of the population so that no one even dream of doing anything, right? But if it's certainly going to backfire if, eventually they get the numbers to rise up against you and throw you over.
The point is that these people would never have converted in the numbers they did without the miraculous intervention of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
That's right.
That's the point.
That's the point. Of course, these Pueblo cities are much farther north than, the Mexican reality. But nevertheless.
I want to add, however, that the amazing conversion of Mary, who became the greatest missionary in the history of the church, because there were millions who were converted, nevertheless was carried on in its own minor way by great men of the church like Eusebio Kino, the Jesuit, who really in New Mexico and Arizona did so much, and Junipero Serra,
Right.
So they carried on what Mary began in a very beautiful way, and
and Christopher Shannon covers that very well, I think, in this opening chapter.
Good. So why don't we've taken France this time, Spain. Why don't we cover France next time, chapter 2?
Okay, sounds good.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everybody. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.